History remembers the world wars as the pinnacle of human destruction. But 3 centuries earlier, a single spark in Prague ignited a fire that consumed a continent for 30 years. It was a war where religion was the mask, power was the prize, and the cost was the erasure of 1/3 of Central Europe's population. This is not just a chronicle of battles, but the story of how the modern world was forged in the literal ashes of the old. A spark in the powder keg. We often believe that the great tragedies of history are born from grand designs. But what if the collapse of an entire civilization began with a single act of defiance in a room high above the streets of Prague? Imagine a world where your neighbor's prayer is a declaration of war, and where the fragile peace of a continent rests on the shoulders of men who believe they are doing God's work by killing their brothers. Why did a simple dispute over a church window lead to the deaths of 8 million people? To understand the apocalypse that was the 30 Years' War, we must first look at the map of 1618. It was not a map of nations as we know them today, but a chaotic mosaic known as the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling fractured mess of over 300 duchies, city-states and bishoprics, held together by a thin veneer of imperial authority. Underneath this surface, a century of religious hatred was boiling. The Reformation had split the soul of Europe in two, leaving Catholics and Protestants locked in a cold war that was rapidly turning hot. The tension found its breaking point on a May morning in Prague. 2 imperial representatives of the Catholic Habsburg king, Ferdinand II, were sent to tell the Protestant lords of Bohemia that their rights to worship were being revoked. The response was not a debate, but a scream. The officials were seized and hurled out of a 3rd-story window of the Hodkany castle, falling 70 feet toward the hard ground below. They survived. The full Catholics claimed angels caught them. Protestants joked they landed in a pile of manure, but the impact shattered the peace of Europe forever. This was the defenestration of Prague. It wasn't just a local riot. It was a signal to every king, prince, and mercenary in Europe that the time for talking was over. But ask yourself, was this truly about the soul? Or was religion simply the most convenient excuse for an ancient grab for land and gold? As the news of the defiance spread, the Habsburgs realized that if they lost Bohemia, they lost their grip on the empire. And if the Protestants succeeded, the entire Catholic order would crumble. Both sides began to call in their debts, mobilizing armies that would soon grow far beyond their control. The match had been struck, and the powder keg was far larger than anyone in that room in Prague could have possibly imagined. As the first fires began to burn across the Bohemian countryside, the people of Europe had no way of knowing that the sun would not set on this conflict for 3 decades. What happens to a society when the law of the land is replaced by the law of the sword, the mercenary king and the business of death? As the smoke cleared from the initial Bohemian revolt, a terrifying realization dawned on the people of Europe. The kings had started a fire they could no longer afford to put out. If you were a peasant in the 1620s, the greatest threat to your life wasn't a foreign invader's ideology, it was the very soldier who claimed to be your protector. Have you ever wondered how a war sustains itself for decades when the treasuries of empires run dry? The answer lies in the rise of the military entrepreneur. And no name struck more terror into the hearts of the innocent than Albrecht von Wallenstein. He was a man who saw the slaughter of Europe not as a tragedy, but as a massive business opportunity. Wallenstein understood a brutal economic reality. If a king cannot pay his troops, the troops must pay themselves. This birthed the system of contributions, a polite term for legalized, systematic plunder. The war transitioned from a clash of convictions into a self-perpetuating engine of destruction. Armies became wandering states, vast, hungry organisms of tens of thousands of soldiers, followed by an equal number of camp followers, wives, and children. They moved across the landscape like locusts, stripping the earth bare of grain, livestock, and hope. This was the business of death, where the mercenaries' loyalty lasted only as long as the next village had bread to steal. But consider the psychological toll of such a system. When a soldier's survival depends on the total deprivation of a civilian, what remains of human morality? The distinction between friend and foe vanished, replaced by the distinction between those with weapons and those without. In this era, the mercenary became the dominant figure of the aegis of no country and no creed, selling their swords to the highest bidder, whether they were Catholic or Protestant. The Holy Roman Empire became a fractured hunting ground. Great commanders like Tilly and Wallenstein pushed the boundaries of what a professional army could achieve, but they also unlocked a chaos they couldn't fully restrain. The war was no longer about the defenestration or the rights of Bohemian lords. It had become an industry, and like any industry, it required raw materials to keep running. In this case, the raw materials were the lives and livelihoods of millions of Europeans. If the first decade of the war was defined by the chaos of the mercenary, the second would be defined by a man who brought a chilling, divine order to the carnage. As the Catholic forces seemed on the verge of a total, crushing victory, a shadow lengthened from the north. A king was coming who claimed to fight for God, but who had perfected the art of killing with a precision the world had never seen. If Wallenstein turned war into a business, what happens when the next player turns it into a science? The Lion of the North, a tactical revolution. By 1630, the Protestant cause was gasping for air, pinned under the weight of the Catholic Habsburg juggernaut. But then, from the frozen mists of the Baltic, a new force arrived, a king who carried a Bible in one hand and a musket in the other. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, didn't just join the war, he reinvented it. Have you ever wondered how a small, peripheral nation like Sweden could suddenly dictate the fate of the entire European continent? Gustavus Adolphus was not interested in the slow, grinding sieges of the past. He saw that the business of death was inefficient. To win a war of this scale, he realized he needed a machine that moved faster and hit harder than anything the world had seen since the legions of Rome. He introduced a tactical revolution of combined arms, integrating mobile light artillery, disciplined musketeers, and aggressive cavalry into a single, lethal symphony of fire. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, the world watched in horror and awe as the Swedish king dismantled the supposedly invincible imperial formations. He didn't just outfight them, he outthought them. His soldiers were not just mercenaries, they were a national army, fueled by a sense of religious mission and personal loyalty to their king. This wasn't just a change in formation, it was a change in the very nature of human combat. But as the Swedish boots marched deeper into German soil, a chilling question began to emerge. When the savior of a cause becomes an occupier, is there any difference to the people living under his heel? Gustavus claimed to be the protector of Protestantism, yet his liberating army was just as hungry as the one it replaced. The fields of Germany were being soaked in the blood of men from every corner of the map. Swedes, Finns, Scots, and Germans, all dying for a king's vision of a new world order. The Lion of the North would eventually fall in the fog of Lutzen, a hero's death that left a power vacuum no one could fill. His death proved a terrifying point. In this war, even the most brilliant leaders were eventually consumed by the flames they helped fan. With the Swedish king gone and the imperial treasury bankrupt, the war should have ended. Instead, it mutated. Why did the conflict continue when both sides were exhausted and their champions were dead? Because across the border in France, a man of the cloth was watching the carnage with a cold, calculating eye. He didn't care about the salvation of souls. He cared about the map. What happens when the war of religion finally drops the mask and reveals the cold, hard face of geopolitics? The shadow of the cardinal. Faith yields to reason. What do you do when the most powerful Catholic official in France decides to fund the Protestant side of a religious war? In the mid-1630s, the mask of piety finally slipped, revealing a terrifying new logic that would govern the world for centuries to come. Is it possible for a war started in the name of God to survive the moment it becomes entirely about the ego of kings? Enter Cardinal Richelieu, the red-robed mastermind of French policy. Though he was a prince of the Catholic Church, his loyalty was not to the Pope in Rome, but to the crown of France. He looked at the 30 Years' War and saw not a struggle for the soul, but a golden opportunity to break the Habsburg ring that encircled his country. To Richelieu, a weak, divided Germany was more important than a Catholic one. This was the birth of raison d'être, the reason of state. It was a cold, secular philosophy that suggested the interests of the nation-state outweigh any religious or moral obligation. By pouring French gold into Swedish pockets and eventually sending French bayonets into the fray, Richelieu transformed a German civil war into a full-scale European world war. Consider the betrayal felt by the common soldier. If you had spent 15 years fighting for the true faith, how did it feel to see the greatest cardinal in Christendom joining forces with your heretical enemies? The war had lost its moral compass. It was no longer a crusade. It was a chess match played on a board made of human lives. As France and Spain, the two great Catholic superpowers, turned their blades on each other, the original causes of the war were almost forgotten. The conflict had become a monster that lived for its own sake. The armies were now so large and the stakes so high that no one knew how to stop the momentum. The diplomatic cables were no longer filled with talk of theology, but with talk of borders, mountain passes, and strategic fortresses. But while the elites in Paris, Madrid, and Vienna redrew maps in their comfortable studies, the people on the ground were reaching a breaking point. The transition from a religious war to a political one meant there was no longer a holy end in sight, only endless attrition. What happens to a continent when the leaders stop pretending to be saints and start acting like accountants of death? As the high politics of Richelieu took hold, the land itself began to die. The exhaustion of nations and the scourge of famine. Imagine a world where the living envy the dead, where the smell of wood smoke doesn't mean a warm hearth, but a village being erased from the map. By the 1640s, the 30 Years' War was no longer a series of battles. It was a biological and social collapse. Have you ever wondered what remains of a civilization when every structure of authority, the church, the law, and even the family is stripped away by decades of trauma? The most terrifying enemy of this era wasn't a general or a king. It was the horsemen of the apocalypse. Famine and plague had become the true masters of Europe. The constant movement of armies across the German heartland had destroyed the cycle of the seasons. Farmers refused to plant crops they knew would be burned before the harvest, leading to a catastrophe where the population of some regions plummeted by over 50%. Reports from this period describe scenes that haunt the historical record. Peasants reduced to eating grass, leather, and, in the darkest corners of the Rhine, even the flesh of the deceased. It was a total breakdown of the human spirit. The soldiers, too, were dying in droves, not from musket balls, but from typhus and dysentery. The war had become a war of exhaustion, where the goal was no longer to conquer territory, but simply to outlast the enemy's ability to exist. But consider the psychological landscape of a generation born and raised entirely within this carnage. By 1645, there were men and women in their 20s who had never known a day of peace. To them, the sight of a burning horizon was as natural as a sunset. This was a culture of war, where the only currency was violence and the only hope was survival. Why did it take so long for the leaders to sue for peace? The tragedy was that the war had become so complex, with so many stakeholders: the Swedes, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the hundreds of German princes, that finding a solution felt impossible. Every time a peace talk began, a new grievance or a new territorial grab would restart the fire. Yet, beneath the despair, a profound shift was occurring. The sheer scale of the horror was forcing the survivors to ask a radical question: is any religious truth or dynastic pride worth this? The exhaustion was so total that it finally broke the will of the monarchs. The stage was being set for a meeting that would change the way humans interact forever. What happens when the world finally decides that the only way to save the future is to completely rewrite the rules of the past? The Peace of Westphalia, redefining sovereignty. After 30 years of blood and ash, the leaders of Europe did something unprecedented. They didn't just stop fighting. They decided to change the definition of a nation. In 1648, in the cities of Munster and Osnabrück, the first modern diplomatic congress was born. But how do you sit across the table from a man who has spent 3 decades trying to erase your people from the earth? The Peace of Westphalia was not a single moment of triumph, but a grueling process of compromise between exhausted powers. The negotiators realized that the old dream of a universal Christian empire was dead. If Europe was to survive, it needed a new operating system. This led to the birth of the concept we now call Westphalian sovereignty, the idea that a state has exclusive authority over its own territory and its own people, and that no outside power has the right to interfere, not even for the sake of religion. For the first time, the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, was expanded and solidified. It was a cold admission that people would never agree on the path to heaven, so they had to agree on the laws of the earth. This treaty effectively ended the era of large-scale religious wars in Europe. It shifted the focus from the salvation of souls to the stability of borders. But consider the magnitude of this shift. By recognizing the sovereignty of every small German state, the treaty fundamentally broke the power of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor became a figurehead, and the modern nation-state began to emerge as the primary actor on the world stage. It was a victory for the secular over the sacred, and for the diplomat over the crusader. Yet, as the pens moved across the parchment, the silence that fell over the battlefields was deafening. The war didn't end because someone won. It ended because there was nothing left to burn. The diplomats were building a new world on top of a graveyard. The question remained, Could a piece of paper truly heal a continent that had forgotten the meaning of peace? As the soldiers began their long, hollow marches home, they walked through a landscape that was unrecognizable. The treaty could redraw the maps, but it couldn't bring back the dead or rebuild the thousands of ghost towns that littered the countryside. What was the true inheritance of this ruin, and how does a shattered people begin to breathe again in a world that has finally, mercifully, gone quiet? The inheritance of ruin, a new Europe emerges. When the bells finally rang for peace in 1648, they didn't ring for a victory. They rang for a funeral. The 30 Years' War had fundamentally altered the DNA of Western civilization, leaving behind a scarred earth and a traumatized collective memory. But if the conflict was the darkest hour, was the world that followed actually brighter, or just more efficient in its violence? The cost of the war is almost impossible to wrap the modern mind around. In some parts of Germany, it took 200 years for the population to return to its 1618 levels. Entire dialects had vanished. Entire industries had been erased. The physical inheritance of the war was a landscape of ruins, shattered cathedrals, abandoned mines, and forests that had reclaimed once thriving villages. This was the 0 hour for Central Europe, a trauma that would stay buried in the cultural psyche for centuries, influencing everything from German folklore to the grim philosophy of the Enlightenment. But out of this ruin, the foundations of the modern world were poured. The war forced humanity to separate the church from the state out of pure necessity for survival. It gave birth to the professional standing army, the complex bureaucracy of the modern tax system, and the very concept of international law. We live in a world of borders, passports, and embassies, all of which are the direct descendants of the exhaustion felt in the 1640s. Ask yourself, would we have reached the age of reason without first passing through this age of fire? The Enlightenment was, in many ways, a desperate reaction to the madness of the 30 Years' War, a collective decision by the thinkers of Europe that reason must govern human affairs because religious passion had nearly ended them. The war taught Europe that when we fight for absolute, uncompromising truths, we often end up with absolute, uncompromising destruction. The 30 Years' War stands as a permanent warning. It shows us how quickly a civilization can unravel when dialogue is replaced by dogma and when the business of conflict becomes more profitable than the stability of peace. It reminds us that the maps we draw and the gods we worship are often used as shields for the same ancient hunger for power. As we look back at the defenestration of Prague, the mercenary greed of Wallenstein, and the cold calculations of Richelieu, we see the mirrors of our own world. The conflict ended not with a grand epiphany, but with a weary sigh. It left behind a Europe that was colder, more secular, and more divided by borders, yet finally capable of coexistence. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson of the 30 Years' War is that peace is not the absence of disagreement, but the weary realization that some prices are simply too high to pay.